People think they understand what happened in Venezuela. They think it was about a dictator. They think it was about drugs. They think it was just another headline that will be forgotten in a week. But at 2:01 a.m., on January 3, 2026, something happened that quietly rewrote the rules of global power. American helicopters landed on Venezuelan soil. Within minutes, a president who had survived sanctions, protests, and years of international isolation was no longer in control of his country or his fate. And here's the part almost everyone missed. This operation wasn't really about Nicolas Maduro. It wasn't even about Venezuela. It was about China. What you're witnessing isn't an isolated incident. It's the first move in a much larger confrontation, one that will decide who controls resources, trade routes, and influence across an entire hemisphere. This is the moment a 200-year-old doctrine came back to life with a new name and far more dangerous consequences. Welcome to Financial Codex, where we break down power, money, and geopolitics beyond the headlines, so you understand not just what happened, but why it matters for most of the world. The arrest of Nicolas Maduro looked like the final chapter of a long, predictable story. A sanctioned leader, a collapsing economy, years of political isolation. From the outside, it felt almost inevitable. Another strongman finally falling under the weight of his own failures. But geopolitics is rarely that simple, because if this was really about Maduro, it would have happened years ago. The United States had sanctioned him. The European Union had isolated him. Latin America had turned its back on him. Venezuela's economy had already imploded. Inflation had erased savings. Millions had fled the country. By every conventional measure, Maduro was already defeated. And yet, nothing happened. Until now. That timing matters more than most people realize. In January 2026, Venezuela was no longer just a failed state struggling to survive. It had quietly become something else entirely. A strategic asset in a much larger global confrontation. While headlines focused on domestic repression and drug charges, a far more important shift was happening behind the scenes. China had been moving in. Over the past decade, Beijing didn't just lend Venezuela money. It embedded itself into the country's infrastructure, energy sector, and logistics networks. Chinese firms took control of oil-backed loans. Chinese technology entered ports, surveillance systems, and communications. What looked like economic assistance was, in reality, long-term leverage. For Washington, this was crossing a red line. Venezuela sits in the United States' immediate sphere of influence, not symbolically, but geographically. It controls access to critical Caribbean shipping lanes. It holds some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, and it sits uncomfortably close to U.S. territory. For over a century, American strategy in the Western Hemisphere followed one unspoken rule: no rival superpower gets to establish permanent influence here. That rule had been bent before, but in Venezuela, it was close to being broken. By 2025, intelligence assessments began shifting tone. This was no longer about ideology or democracy. It was about balance of power, about supply chains, about who would control energy flows in a world already fractured by conflict and economic nationalism. Maduro, intentionally or not, had become the gatekeeper of something far bigger than himself. That's why the operation was surgical. That's why it was sudden. And that's why it didn't look like traditional regime change. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a coup broadcast on live television. It was a message delivered quietly, decisively, and with global implications. The arrest of one man was never the end goal. It was a signal to Beijing, a signal to allies, and a warning to every country sitting at the crossroads between American decline and Chinese expansion. Because Venezuela wasn't the target, it was the test case. And what happened there would shape how power is enforced, not just in Latin America, but across the world in the years to come. To understand why Venezuela suddenly mattered again, you have to zoom out from Caracas and look at Beijing. For China, Venezuela was never about ideology or friendship. It was about math, oil, leverage, and geography. At a time when China's economy needed guaranteed energy supplies, and political allies outside the US-led system, Venezuela offered both, cheaply. By the mid-2010s, China had already poured tens of billions of dollars into Venezuela through oil-backed loans. On paper, this looked like development financing. In reality, it was a trap disguised as lifeline. Venezuela didn't pay China back with cash. It paid with oil. Long-term oil shipments locked in at discounted prices, insulating China from global market shocks. But energy was only the beginning. Chinese state-linked companies began appearing in Venezuelan ports, telecom networks, and security infrastructure. Surveillance technology followed. Digital identification systems, data pipelines. Each investment deepened dependency. Each project reduced Caracas's ability to act independently. From Washington's perspective, this wasn't aid. It was encroachment. The United States had tolerated Chinese economic expansion across Africa and parts of Asia. But Latin America was different. This wasn't a distant theater. This was the Western Hemisphere, a region historically treated as non-negotiable in American strategy. And Venezuela was becoming the most dangerous foothold of all. By 2024, intelligence analysts were no longer asking whether China had influence in Venezuela. They were asking how deeply embedded it had become, and whether that influence could be reversed without force. The answers were uncomfortable. If China consolidated control over Venezuelan energy exports, it would gain leverage over global oil markets. If Chinese technology dominated Venezuelan ports, Beijing could quietly monitor shipping routes passing through the Caribbean. If Venezuela fell fully into China's orbit, it would signal to other struggling states that U.S. pressure could be defied and replaced. That precedent was unacceptable. But removing Maduro wasn't simple. A public military invasion would have shattered alliances. A loud regime change operation would have confirmed every fear about American imperialism. The cost would have outweighed the benefit. So strategy shifted. Instead of targeting the state, the focus narrowed to the individual. Legal frameworks replaced military ones. Narco-terrorism wasn't just a criminal charge, it was a jurisdictional weapon. It created a legal pathway to remove a head of state without tanks crossing borders. This is where the arrest becomes clearer. Maduro wasn't taken because he was weak. He was taken because he had become strategically inconvenient. The timing wasn't random. It aligned with tightening U.S.-China competition, supply chain decoupling, and rising tensions over energy security. Venezuela was no longer just a failed socialist experiment. It was a chess piece sitting too close to Washington's king. And chess doesn't allow sentiment. When the helicopters lifted off that night, the message wasn't aimed at Caracas, it was aimed across the Pacific. China had crossed a line, and for the first time in decades, the United States decided to enforce one. But the real consequences of that decision were only just beginning. To understand why the United States acted the way it did, you have to understand something deeper than Venezuela. You have to understand doctrine. For decades, American foreign policy in Latin America followed a predictable rhythm: pressure, sanctions, diplomacy, and when things collapsed, strategic patience. Even during the Cold War, Washington preferred influence over intervention. The goal wasn't control, it was containment. But containment only works when the rival plays by the same rules. By the mid-2020s, U.S. strategists began reaching an uncomfortable conclusion. China wasn't just competing. Economically, it was rewriting the structure of influence itself. Instead of military bases, Beijing built debt. Instead of alliances, it built dependencies. Instead of ideology, it offered survival. That model was far harder to confront. Traditional tools failed. Sanctions pushed states closer to China. Diplomatic pressure lost its bite. Even isolation became ineffective when Beijing could replace Western markets, technology, and financing. So Washington adapted. What emerged wasn't a public policy shift. There was no announcement, no doctrine speech broadcast to the world. Instead, it was a quiet recalibration, a willingness to target nodes of influence rather than entire regimes. Venezuela became the proving ground. Maduro wasn't just a president. He was the connector between Chinese capital, Venezuelan resources, and regional influence. Remove him, and the network destabilizes. Keep him, and the network solidifies. This logic explains the precision of the operation. The arrest wasn't designed to shock global markets. It wasn't designed to inspire rebellion. It was designed to create uncertainty. Investors hesitated. Chinese planners paused. Regional governments recalculated their risk. Uncertainty in geopolitics is power. What made this shift dangerous was its precedent. If the United States could legally and operationally remove a sitting head of state under criminal jurisdiction, the rules had changed. Sovereignty was no longer absolute. Strategic alignment mattered more than formal titles. That terrified some allies as much as it worried adversaries. But from Washington's perspective, the alternative was worse. Allow China to normalize deep strategic penetration in the Western Hemisphere, and the credibility of American deterrence collapses. Once that credibility is gone, it doesn't return easily. This is why officials avoided dramatic language, no victory speeches, no flags. The quieter the operation, the stronger the message. Power was being exercised without spectacle, and that silence was intentional, because this wasn't about winning headlines. It was about establishing a new baseline, a signal that the era of passive response was over, that economic encroachment would now carry personal risk, and that leaders who positioned their countries as platforms for rival powers would no longer be untouchable. Venezuela was the test case, not because it was unique, but because it was visible. If the strategy worked here, it could work elsewhere, and that realization set off a chain reaction no one could fully control. The arrest didn't end in Venezuela. That was only where it started. Within hours, diplomatic channels lit up across 3 continents, not because governments were confused about what had happened, but because they understood exactly what it meant. A rule had been broken, or more accurately, a rule had been replaced. Markets reacted first. Energy traders didn't wait for official statements. Venezuelan crude futures spiked, then froze. Insurance premiums for Caribbean shipping routes quietly rose. Companies exposed to Chinese Latin American energy deals began revising risk models that hadn't been touched in years. Uncertainty spreads faster than fear. In Beijing, the reaction was restrained but sharp. There were no public threats, no dramatic speeches. Instead, internal directives went out to Chinese state firms operating in politically fragile countries. Exposure was reassessed. Projects were paused. Legal frameworks were tightened. China understood the message and chose caution over escalation. That choice mattered because it revealed something crucial. Even China wasn't ready to openly challenge American enforcement in the Western Hemisphere. Not yet. Elsewhere, the message landed differently. In Latin America, leaders who had balanced between Washington and Beijing suddenly felt the ground shift beneath them. Countries that had welcomed Chinese investment without political alignment began asking quiet questions. How much protection did sovereignty really offer? Where was the line between partnership and liability? For some governments, the answer was uncomfortable. Publicly, many condemned the arrest as a violation of international norms. Privately, they recalibrated. Trade negotiations slowed. Security cooperation with the United States quietly resumed. Political neutrality became harder to defend when consequences turned personal. Europe reacted with unease, while officially aligned with Washington. European capitals worried about precedent. If criminal jurisdiction could override political status, where did that leave leaders operating in legal gray zones? The concern wasn't sympathy for Maduro. It was anxiety about the future. Power that moves quietly is harder to constrain. Meanwhile, inside Venezuela, the impact was immediate but fragmented. The state didn't collapse. The military didn't fracture overnight. Instead, paralysis set in. Decision-making stalled. Loyalties blurred. The system had been built around one man, and without him, no clear replacement emerged. That vacuum was intentional. A clean regime change would have forced the United States to manage the aftermath. Chaos created distance. It allowed Washington to influence outcomes without owning them. Responsibility remained diffuse. Control remained indirect. This was influence without occupation. But the most important shockwave wasn't diplomatic or economic. It was psychological. For the first time in decades, Leaders across the developing world had to consider a new variable in their calculations. Personal risk, not sanctions, not speeches, not condemnation, actual removal. That realization altered behavior. Deals with China became more cautious, military posturing softened, strategic ambiguity increased. No one wanted to become the next example. The arrest didn't start a war. It didn't need to change the equation. And once equations change, outcomes follow. The true impact of what happened in Venezuela won't be measured in days or months. It will be measured in how states behave when the cameras are gone. Because after the shock faded, something subtle but permanent changed in global strategy. For years, mid-sized and fragile countries believed they could hedge indefinitely. Take American security guarantees while accepting Chinese money, technology, and political cover. Venezuela exposed the limits of that strategy. The illusion of playing both sides collapsed the moment consequences became personal. That is the real legacy of this operation. China didn't retreat from the world, it adapted. Beijing shifted away from highly visible political entanglements and toward quieter, more distributed investments. Influence became harder to trace, more legally insulated, less dependent on individual leaders. Venezuela taught China where pressure points existed and where to avoid them. But adaptation cuts both ways. The United States also crossed a threshold it can't easily step back from. By choosing enforcement over tolerance, Washington accepted a new burden: consistency. Once rules are applied selectively, credibility erodes. Every future decision will be judged against Venezuela. Why here? Why now? Why not elsewhere? Those questions don't disappear. Allies will demand reassurance. Rivals will test boundaries. Neutral states will look for loopholes. The strategy only works if it's followed through, and follow-through is costly. Inside Latin America, the effects will unfold slowly. Governments won't publicly abandon China, but they will dilute exposure. Projects will be segmented, contracts rewritten, dependencies disguised as diversification. The region won't choose sides, but it will fear choosing wrong. That fear becomes leverage. For Venezuela itself, the future is less dramatic and more uncertain. No instant recovery, no clean rebirth, just prolonged negotiation over who fills the vacuum left behind. Power brokers will emerge. External actors will compete quietly. The country will remain a bargaining chip long after the headlines move on. That's the cruel irony. Maduro's arrest didn't free Venezuela, it repositioned it. And repositioning is the currency of great power competition. What we are witnessing is not the return of Cold War tactics. It's something colder, less ideological, more transactional. A world where influence is enforced through legal frameworks, economic pressure, and targeted disruption rather than armies and occupation. A world where leaders are judged not just by what they do, but by who they align with. Venezuela was never the prize. It was the proof of concept. Proof that red lines still exist. Proof that geography still matters. Proof that power, when challenged, eventually responds. The question now isn't whether this strategy will be used again. It's where and how often. Because once a method works, it doesn't stay unique for long. What happened in Venezuela wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new phase in global power. If you want to understand how money, influence, and geopolitics really work behind the headlines, this is Financial Codex. Subscribe, because the next move is already in motion.